Okay. Good morning, everyone. We are happy to have you here. This is the official kickoff of the webinar series for the agronomic crops team. We hope you enjoyed the presentations that our speakers are going to have prepared and are going to prepare for the rest of the year. As a reminder, our webinars have been scheduled for the second Tuesday of each month, starting at 9 a.m. These webinars are going to be recorded, so if you cannot make it for that day and that time, you will be able to watch the presentations later, and also these presentations are going to be available so you can share those with the farmers in your area, or if you schedule other meetings. With that said, I will introduce two of the speakers of this morning, Dr. Balkcom from USDA ARS, and Max Frangi from the Department of Ag Economics. We also are going to have Dr. Austin Hagan presenting from Tuscaloosa. Dr. Joyce Ducar was scheduled also for this morning, but she's currently traveling to Tuscaloosa, so we don't know if she will be able to make it on time. Otherwise, we will make her presentation available at the end of this week. So with that said, I will let Dr. Balkcom to start with his presentation.
Okay. Hey, good morning, everybody. Obviously, the topic today is nitrogen management for Alabama wheat, and I certainly want to recognize someone here that was instrumental in working with this project, Charlie Burmeister. He's retired, obviously, but he certainly helped with setting up this project and kind of coming up with the questions and what we were trying to answer. So I want to recognize his efforts for sure. Basically, this work came about. We started this in 2008, and that was when wheat production was really starting to increase in the state. You can look at this graph and see how it really jumped up to around 200,000 acres and stayed fairly steady. And I obviously only kept data to 2014, but that's what led to this work, the questions that were associated with this type of work for wheat. Now, the background for this was when people were getting back into wheat production, they had a lot of questions about the management practices to maximize their wheat yields. And one of the things is they were interested in conservation tillage practices, and they wanted to know if they needed to apply higher nitrogen rates with these types of systems. And there were concerns related to if you're using conservation systems, would it delay wheat emergence and plant development? And then in addition to the nitrogen rates, they were concerned about the timing of application. So these were kind of the questions that helped guide us to set up this experiment to examine wheat production here in Alabama. And one of the things, I think most people recognize this, but I just want to mention it. This is some data that Dr. Charlie Mitchell shared from the colors rotation, and it kind of makes a good point. Nitrogen obviously can be a limiting factor for wheat production. And you can see there that lime is probably the most limiting factor. But generally, that's not going to be a problem. Most people know to keep their fields lined and so forth. But notice how phosphorus and potassium can be very detrimental for wheat production. So we can talk about trying to maximize nitrogen, correct timing and all those kind of things. But if we don't have the phosphorus and potassium levels correct, it's not going to make any difference. So that's just kind of a reminder for everyone, and to use a general soil test and make sure you correct those problems as well. For the objectives for this research, we looked at determining the level of tillage necessary to optimize wheat yields, and then determine optimum nitrogen fertilizer rates and timing across these tillage systems. And this little picture here, and I should have referenced, I can't remember where exactly it came from. It was something from the Extension Service. But you can see, we have a high concentration of wheat. Each one of those dots represents a certain number of acres. We have a high concentration in North Alabama, some in Central Alabama, and then a good distribution across Southeast and Southwest Alabama. So fortunately, in the Alabama Extension system, our experiment station system, we have locations that correspond to those areas. So we set up this project in each of those 4 locations at Tennessee Valley, E.B. Smith, Wiregrass, and Gulf Coast. And so we have 4 different soil types, and we did this for 12 site years. So we have a pretty robust data set to take a look at this information for tillage and nitrogen. And I certainly don't want to imply that this is the end-all test for wheat and nitrogen. It just happens to be the latest information that we have related to wheat and nitrogen in Alabama. Like I said, we did have 12 site years, but unfortunately we had to drop 3 of those years. And I'll tell you the reason why. At Tennessee Valley, we had head scab that hit up there, and the yields were down. They weren't as bad as what you would think, but they were low for Tennessee Valley, and obviously we just didn't want to chance any kind of differences associated with the scab versus our treatment. So we threw that one out. We had a bad choice on a variety at Gulf Coast. We had one that was planted with a long vernalization period, and obviously we were not going to get that at Gulf Coast. So we threw that one out. And then at Wiregrass, we had an area that was extremely sandy area, and it was low in phosphorus. And unfortunately, even though several people communicated we need to put phosphorus out, I don't think it ever got put out because our yields were the highest were 20 bushels to the acre. So we just didn't use that. Obviously, we didn't want to confound our results with that. So these are the 9 site years that we wound up with. You can see the first one was at Tennessee Valley, obviously initiated in the fall of 2007. You can see the soil series, the cultivar that was used, the planting date, and the harvest date for these 9 site years, just to give you an idea of what we were dealing with and how planting dates and harvest dates corresponded. Now, our design we used was just a simple split plot design. We had a tillage system as the main plot. We used conventional tillage or non-inversion. And with non-inversion, we use that's in this picture here on the top left, that KMC subsoil leveler. And basically it eliminates deep compaction, but it also maintains some residue on the soil surface. And then at Tennessee Valley, because we were dealing with a different soil type up there, a little bit heavier, we looked at straight no tillage there. And then for our subplots, we had 12 different combinations of nitrogen rates. And this included, we had some fall application where we used granular fertilizer, and then we came back in the spring with typically a 28% UAN solution. And you notice here we had 12 different nitrogen rates by 4 replications. That's 48 plots times 2 tillage treatments. That's 96. So each one of these tests was very large tests. There was a lot of labor associated with these tests, but I feel like it did generate some good information for us. The treatments here, this just gives you a list of the 12 different treatments and application times. You can see we looked at fall applied nitrogen with 0 or either about 20 pounds. We possibly could have went a little bit higher than that, but obviously we didn't want to burn the wheat or anything. And then we split up rates across Feeks 4, Feeks 6 growth stages. And basically we just looked at 3 different rates there, 60, 90, and 120 pounds. 90 being our recommended, 60 would be a low, and then 20 would be just a high. And then we split those up, and you can see the combinations of, sometimes we split them over the growth stages, sometimes, and then when we applied fall nitrogen, we just made up the difference either at Feeks 4 or at Feeks 6. And for those of you, just to remember, reminder, Feeks 4 is approximately, in the test that we were doing here and the conditions we had, Feeks 4 was occurring approximately around early to mid-February, and maybe a couple of weeks later at Tennessee Valley, but that was roughly the time frame. And then Feeks 6 would come in about a month after that, approximately. So that shows you kind of our times of application. This is just a picture from Wiregrass, kind of shows one of the locations. You can see we did have a lot of variability in the experiment as far as very green plants to very obviously nitrogen deficient plants. So there was definitely some differences we observed across this experiment. One of the things that we looked at which is obviously important in wheat is tiller data. We counted these tillers at the Feeks 4. Some of you are probably familiar with the tiller work that's been done in North Carolina, where people are using those to help guide nitrogen fertilization. And we were trying to take a look at that. So that's why we wanted to count the tillers as well. But if you take a look at these effects here, tillage and fall nitrogen, because fall in was the only thing that would have been applicable for tiller data at that time, because no nitrogen was put on until after we counted the tillers. But notice how for the tillage data, At Tennessee Valley, there's actually no effect among tiller data for the tillage, no effect there, and very little effect on the coastal plain soils. And we had one location that actually conventional tillage favored more tillers, but it was not certainly not a consistent effect that we saw for tillage and tillers. Now, for the nitrogen, fall nitrogen, it was imperative. If you notice at Tennessee Valley, we didn't see any benefit, which basically says to me there is some residual nitrogen that we're getting on those soils up there. And generally we don't account for residual nitrogen for soil tests in Alabama. And in this case, I think we did see a little bit, but I think it had to do with because it was in the fall. If you went back and if you were planting a crop in the spring, that nitrogen might have been denitrified or leached over the winter, and it probably would not have been there. But because of the timing of when we planted the crop, we did see a little bit of benefit. But then if you notice on the coastal plain soils, each one of these where the X is, it was obviously highly significant. The fall applied in was extremely important to promote tiller production on these sandier soils. And that's kind of intuitive. That's what we'd expect. It kind of confirms some of the stuff that we have observed in the past. When we take a look at tiller counts, like I say, we were trying to see if we could see any kind of relationship with this, and we looked at that compared to the wheat yields, and there is a relationship, but it's still, there's a lot of variability there. I can explain about 50% of it, but notice how, we'd like to see a maximum that occurs maybe down, more in this range would be more what you would be looking for. Our maximum occurred way over here, probably maybe 175 tillers per square foot, which is really a large number. Some of those, I mentioned the work in North Carolina, and they'll use a cutoff of say somewhere around 50 tillers per square foot, roughly. And if you look at that, look how much variability we had. Or even if you go to 100, we had some that were down at 35 bushels to the acre. And then we had some all the way up to 110. So what that's saying is, obviously, there's a lot of things that can happen to those tillers from the time you count them to the time you actually harvest. You can't just guarantee that you have tillers in the spring that you're going to guarantee a yield in the end. And so, again, we tried to compare this with some different things, looking at nitrogen concentration of those tillers, and you can see no relationship there. And then, of course, we looked at nitrogen concentration and wheat yield because we had it, but you really don't want to do this even if there was a relationship, because it's going to be time consuming. You're going to have to collect the tillers, dry them, grind them, get them analyzed, which is kind of defeating the whole purpose. That's the beauty of the tiller counts, is you can go out, you can do it, a farmer can do it, a crop consultant can do it, go out and you get an instant value that then hopefully you can relate it to some kind of nitrogen rate. That's the ultimate goal of what we're trying to go for. When we look at some of that data, as far as how it compared across the locations, as I said, the fall in was imperative. You see how it increased the tiller density at coastal plain, and then the biomass. It also, we had bigger plants, seemed like healthier plants on the coastal plain. Limestone Valley, you can see there was no effect, but we had more tillers in general at Tennessee Valley. But notice that the plants were much smaller. If you look at that compared to coastal plain, even though there was no difference in biomass, we had smaller plants overall. So that was kind of interesting. We also looked at Feed 6 data because, as I said, we applied some nitrogen at Feed 4, so we kind of wanted to see how this had an effect on the plant growth. And you can see here we looked at N concentration on the coastal plain, and where we had, there's actually lower N concentration on the non-inversion tillage system. But then when you look at the plant biomass, we actually had bigger plants. So this is not concerning to me. It's just simply a dilution effect of the nitrogen that was in the plants. And if you take a look at Limestone Valley or Tennessee Valley, you can see we had higher N concentrations, but notice the plant biomass, the plants are smaller. So it's that dilution effect, I think. These were not as diluted. So we just had higher N concentrations there. We did have an interaction that we observed with fall nitrogen and the Feed 4 nitrogen and the coastal plain. And basically it's just showing how with that 20 pounds of nitrogen at the higher N rates, we saw a separation of our plant N concentration, which not surprising, but this just kind of helps support some of the things that we observed looking at the plant data throughout the growing season. When we look at coastal plain, we also saw, this was some more plant data for both locations. And again, it just drives home the point of that fall applied nitrogen on the biomass production. You can see it's much greater where we didn't apply any fall nitrogen. Limestone Valley, this was the only time that I don't really understand this, to be honest with you, but it's the only time we saw significant differences in Limestone Valley across any of these treatments. We did see a nitrogen increase, nitrogen concentration increase for the fall applied in. And then if you take a look at just looking at our spring in rates, that's what I'm calling what we applied at Feeks 4 early in the season, you can see there were some differences, but nothing that justified the high nitrogen, 120 pounds. We did not see a need for that in these particular site years that we examined. So, the recommendations were still holding true. We couldn't justify putting on more nitrogen. For the tillage data, this is related to harvest, the yields, and obviously this is averaged over each of the locations, and we broke it out by coastal plain and limestone valley. And you can see where we had non-inversion, we had about a 6 bushel increase, which is significant. And I think that could be even more significant if you were thinking about where you only had to make one tillage pass and plant versus making multiple tillage passes with a conventional operation. And, it would certainly affect your profitability associated with that because you don't have as many trips across the field. You can see the protein levels were a little bit different, actually a little bit lower for the non-inversion, but again, that was related to that dilution effect that we talked about. And then at Limestone Valley, you can see we didn't see any difference. But in this case, I think that's good. Instead of doing any tillage, we can just drop right in there and plant instead of having to do any kind of tillage operation. So the lack of difference there is good. And you can see, we had higher tillers at Tennessee Valley, and we also had higher yields also. So it kind of supports that. The crude protein, no real difference there between the two at Tennessee Valley. There's more differences observed on the coastal plain sites, and I'll just go over those very quickly. Again, just showing that 20 pounds of nitrogen, we saw an increase. The crude protein was lower, but again, it's being diluted. I'm not concerned about that. This shows how it was very important to put the nitrogen on at Feeks 4. Early in the season, we needed to have that nitrogen on. And then you see the dilution again. But again, that's not, to me, a concern. If somebody's trying to maximize the crude protein, then they may want to handle things a little bit differently. But this shows the only case where we saw a justification for 120 pounds is if it did increase the crude protein of the grain, which it makes sense that it'd probably take a little bit more nitrogen to increase the in concentration in the grain as opposed to maximizing the grain itself. But again, you see there was no justification for that high nitrogen rate on the wheat. This work has been summarized in other places, and I put this slide up here so you can take a look at it if you want to see it. Some of you are probably familiar with the Better Crops Journal. It's put out by IPNI, and if you go to this web link, and it's the year 2011, issue number 3, there's kind of a report written up about this experiment, although it was kind of a preliminary report that we provided to those guys because they did provide some funding. If you're a member of Agronomy Society, you can go to Crops and Soils magazine. They have a write-up about that particular experiment, and they actually used it for a CCA training so people could actually do a self-test on it and get CCA credits. And then, of course, if you really are concerned, it comes from this Agronomy Journal article here that we wrote up related to the work. And I do want to mention one other thing. We talked about tiller counts, but there's a lot of interest in variable rate in applications, and that's using the sensors to predict nitrogen rates on the go. A lot of people use the NDVI, the green seeker, or some. Then there's also the crop circle, the red edge. You basically use these to develop a yield prediction equation and then correlate that with nitrogen rates. And we did take a look at this over all these experiments, and I'll show you the relationship here. This is for the green seeker data, and this is for a lot of, not just the data that I talk about, but this is for 24 site years of data related to wheat and nitrogen fertility that we conduct in Alabama. And you can see here that we apply this yield versus this Feeks 4 INSAE, and that stands for in-season yield in-season estimate of yield. And it's basically the NDVI divided by the growing degree age from the time it was planted to the time you did the sensing. And so you can see there might be a relationship there, but I'm not ready to put it up there to show anybody yet. But we could take that information and possibly develop some kind of algorithm to help us with on-the-go nitrogen fertilization is the goal. And then we also looked at the crop circle data. This is, we didn't have as many locations, but you can see it. I kept it on the same scale. You can see how it's a little bit more sensitive, a little bit smaller. The values are a little bit smaller. But, this one looks like a straight linear relationship. You really want to see some kind of plateau there to know that you've reached a maximum. So with that, just to summarize, the non-inversion and no-tillage produced comparable yields to conventional tillage across Alabama. The fall applied in was essential for coastal plain soils, but not on the limestone valley. Total in applied by Feeds 4 was necessary to optimize yields on the coastal plain. And the tiller data was not successful to predict end requirements under these conditions. Now, one of the things, I want to touch on that. We talked about North Carolina, and they've had some success with this. They're a little bit different latitude than us. And I'm wondering if maybe we should have been counting our tillers maybe a little bit earlier. For example, maybe we need to be counting tillers right now instead of waiting until February. And maybe that could have made a little bit of difference. I'm not sure, but I don't have any data, obviously, to support that. But based on what we saw, I was just curious that might be a solution. And then at Limestone Valley, we just had a lot more. There was obviously factors that in this study that were controlling wheat yield, and it wasn't the nitrogen and the tillage for that particular location. And I certainly want to thank the financial support provided by the Alabama Wheat and Feed Grain Commission and IPNI, and thank the technical support staff at ARS and the experiment stations. And I guess, I don't know if you have any other questions or maybe before we move on.
We might have.
But that concludes my presentation.
Does anyone have questions?
I have sort of a question for you, Kim. In regards to our Hessian flies, one of the effects that it has is it reduces the number of tillers you have per square foot. And in our publication, we have a little bit of thing about if you have like more than 20% of your tillers infested with Hessian fly, don't put the nitrogen on, because your yield potential, your chance of yield potential is going to be low.
Yeah.
So, in sort of thinking about this reduced tillers and infestation levels, and in terms, what kind of guidance would you have in terms of what you found out about putting on the nitrogen? I mean, when do you think you would just abandon the field? Can you kind of make a guesstimate on that? For tillers? I know your dots were all over the place, but
yeah,
and that's what makes you nervous. But
I really don't
it's time
have
to put nitrogen on.
I know I don't have a good answer, because really if you had a low number of tillers, then that would be telling me that I need to be putting the nitrogen on. I need to be trying to salvage what I can there. In terms of like if I had a high number, we may be thinking we want to back off on the nitrogen as far as at that particular growth stage. So it's hard for me to say what would be the ideal cutoff level for when to just say we're not going to put any out. I think hopefully if you put some fall applied in, you'd be able to see that the nitrogen was having some effect on your on the tillers and so forth, and go from there. But I don't have a good answer for that. I have to think about that one some more.
Okay. Yeah, because it just suddenly occurred to me as I was listening to you talk. It's like, well, yeah, that's sort of a similar thing, because I will sort of say, give this recommendation based on the regressions that David Bunton had done about, what your potential yield looks like based on your percent invested tillers at the time you put, in this early winter. So
I think like you're talking about tillers that they're damaged and they're not going to come. They're
Yeah, that's on top of the ones that they even reduce the number of tillers you're going to have per square foot. So that's another story. But
yeah,
so
see,
we're just looking at damaged tillers and not looking at total number when I make my recommendation. But I suddenly got to thinking about
and it could be my mentality, because my mentality is if we don't have enough tillers, then we need to put some more nitrogen out there to get them going. So that's kind of we're coming at it from a different angle. So that's why it's hard for me to say what would be the right number.